In the early months of 2025, the world remained ensnared in the throes of geopolitical tensions. The protracted conflict between Ukraine and Russia had escalated into a full-scale war, drawing international attention and concern. The United States, under the leadership of President Donald Trump, had been a pivotal ally to Ukraine, providing military aid and political support. However, beneath the veneer of alliance, fissures began to emerge, setting the stage for an unprecedented diplomatic confrontation. President Volodymyr Zelensky, a former comedian turned wartime leader, had become the face of Ukrainian resilience. His appeals to the international community for support against Russian aggression resonated globally. Yet, as the war dragged on, the dynamics of international alliances grew increasingly complex. The United States, while publicly supporting Ukraine, harbored internal debates about the extent and nature of its involvement. In February 2025, President Zelensky embarked on a diplomatic mission to Washington, D.C., aiming to solidify support and negotiate critical agreements. Among these was a proposed deal granting the United States access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals, a strategic asset in global technology and defense industries. The anticipation surrounding this visit was palpable, with both nations recognizing the high stakes involved. The initial atmosphere was cordial. Zelensky was welcomed with customary honors, and preliminary discussions hinted at mutual interests. However, beneath the surface, tensions simmered. President Trump, known for his unorthodox approach to diplomacy, harbored expectations of unequivocal gratitude and compliance from allied nations. Zelensky, representing a nation fighting for its sovereignty, sought tangible commitments, particularly concerning security guarantees against further Russian aggression. The stage was set for a critical meeting in the Oval Office, a meeting that would soon devolve into a historic diplomatic debacle. The Oval Office, emblematic of American power and diplomacy, became the arena for an unexpected and heated exchange. President Trump, accompanied by Vice President J.D. Vance, awaited President Zelensky. The agenda encompassed discussions on military aid, economic support, and the pivotal minerals agreement. As the meeting commenced, initial pleasantries quickly gave way to pointed discussions. President Trump expressed frustration over what he perceived as a lack of public appreciation from Ukraine for the support rendered by the United States. He emphasized the substantial military aid provided and insinuated that Ukraine's leadership had not reciprocated with adequate gratitude. President Zelensky, maintaining his composure, acknowledged the support but redirected the conversation towards the pressing need for concrete security assurances. He articulated the existential threat Ukraine faced and the necessity for unwavering support to deter further Russian advances. Zelensky underscored that mere expressions of gratitude were insufficient in the face of ongoing aggression. The dialogue intensified as both leaders stood firm on their positions. President Trump, perceiving Zelensky's stance as obstinate, raised his voice, accusing the Ukrainian leader of jeopardizing the alliance and, by extension, global stability. He suggested that Ukraine's resistance to certain concessions could escalate tensions into a broader conflict, potentially igniting a world war. Zelensky, unwavering, reiterated Ukraine's sovereignty and the imperative of genuine support over symbolic gestures. The exchange escalated into a shouting match, an unprecedented spectacle within the hallowed confines of the Oval Office. The confrontation culminated with President Trump abruptly terminating the meeting, instructing the Ukrainian delegation to leave the White House premises immediately. This extraordinary incident marked the first time a foreign leader was expelled from the White House, sending shockwaves through diplomatic channels worldwide. The planned joint press conference was canceled, and the luncheon prepared for the delegations remained untouched, a stark testament to the breakdown in diplomacy. The abrupt expulsion of President Zelensky from the White House reverberated globally. Media outlets scrambled to report on the incident, with headlines highlighting the unprecedented nature of the diplomatic fallout. Analysts and commentators dissected the implications, speculating on the potential rift between the United States and Ukraine. In Washington, political reactions were swift and divided. Congressional Republicans largely rallied behind President Trump, praising his assertiveness. Senator Lindsey Graham commented, What I saw in the Oval Office was a president standing firm for America's interests. ABC News. Conversely, Democrats expressed dismay, criticizing the administration's handling of the situation and warning of potential repercussions for U.S. foreign policy. Internationally, allies and adversaries alike reacted with a mix of concern and opportunism. European leaders, particularly those in NATO, expressed unease over the apparent discord between two key allies. The incident fueled narratives in Russia, where state media portrayed the confrontation as evidence of Ukraine's isolation and the fragility of its alliances. CNN. Amidst the political turmoil, President Zelensky faced the immediate challenge of recalibrating Ukraine's diplomatic strategy. Recognizing the potential peril of alienation from a principal ally, Zelensky initiated efforts to garner support from European nations, seeking to reinforce Ukraine's position on the global stage. In the wake of the Oval Office incident, President Zelensky embarked on a diplomatic tour across Europe to consolidate support and mitigate the fallout from the confrontation with President Trump. His first stop was London, where he met with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The discussions centered on reinforcing military aid, securing economic assistance, and strategizing diplomatic efforts to counter Russian aggression. The Times. The United Kingdom, reaffirming its commitment to Ukraine, announced an increase in military aid and proposed new economic sanctions against Russia. From London, President Zelensky traveled to Berlin, where he met with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. The meeting carried significant weight, as Germany had historically been cautious about escalating tensions with Russia. However, the dramatic turn of events in Washington had alarmed European leaders, who feared that Ukraine might be left vulnerable if U.S. support waned. Scholz, while refraining from direct criticism of President Trump, assured Zelensky that Germany remained committed to Ukraine's defense. The German government pledged an additional $5 billion in military aid, along with a new batch of Leopard 2 tanks and advanced air defense systems. Europe cannot afford to falter in its support for Ukraine, Scholz stated in a press conference. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron, known for his attempts at mediating between Ukraine and Russia in the past, took a more pragmatic approach. Hosting Zelensky at the Élysée Palace, Macron reiterated France's solidarity but also emphasized the need for diplomatic channels to remain open with Moscow. We must prepare for all scenarios, including ones where the U.S. may scale back its commitments, Macron warned. The European Union, in an emergency summit convened in Brussels, announced a new sanctions package against Russia while also approving a long-term security framework for Ukraine. The move signaled Europe's determination to step up in the face of potential American disengagement. However, European leaders remained deeply concerned about the repercussions of the White House incident on NATO's unity. As Zelensky continued his diplomatic push, Moscow was watching closely. The Kremlin wasted no time in capitalizing on the diplomatic fallout. Russian President Vladimir Putin, who had long sought to weaken Western resolve in supporting Ukraine, saw an opportunity to exploit the divisions. Russian state media went into overdrive, portraying the incident in Washington as proof that Ukraine was losing its most powerful ally. In a televised address, Putin smirked as he referred to the White House incident. The so-called alliance between Ukraine and the West was always a fragile illusion, he declared. Now, even the Americans grow tired of Zelensky's demands. The speech resonated among Russian nationalists, reinforcing the narrative that Moscow was prevailing against a fractured opposition. Behind closed doors, however, Russian military strategists debated their next steps. Some hardliners urged Putin to escalate the conflict further, arguing that with U.S.-Ukraine relations in turmoil, this was the moment to launch a decisive offensive. Others, more cautious, warned that Europe's recent show of solidarity meant that Ukraine was not as isolated as some had hoped. The Russian Foreign Ministry, in a rare diplomatic move, reached out to key European governments, suggesting potential security dialogues aimed at de-escalation. While most NATO countries dismissed these overtures as propaganda, some officials in Hungary and Slovakia privately entertained discussions, hinting at possible cracks in the West's united front. Meanwhile, inside Ukraine, the political and military leadership braced for what might come next. Back in Kiev, the reaction to Zelensky's expulsion from the White House was mixed. While many Ukrainians saw it as an insult to their leader and their nation, others feared the broader implications. Had Ukraine lost its most crucial ally? Was the country now standing alone against Russian aggression? Public demonstrations erupted in Kiev's Independence Square, with thousands of Ukrainians waving flags and chanting slogans against both Russia and what they saw as America's betrayal. A popular protest sign read, "We fought for the world's freedom, and the world abandoned us?" Within Ukraine's government, high-level meetings were held to reassess diplomatic strategies. Some officials argued for doubling down on European alliances, while others suggested that Kiev should attempt to mend relations with Washington. Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, speaking to the press, reassured the public, "Ukraine's fight does not depend on any single ally. Our strength lies in our people, our resilience, and our ability to adapt. The war continues, and so does our resistance." However, privately, concerns were growing. Military commanders warned that if U.S. military aid diminished, Ukraine's ability to sustain its defenses could be significantly impacted within months. Recognizing the urgency, Zelensky made an unprecedented decision, one that would either restore Ukraine's standing or plunge it into deeper uncertainty. Determined not to let the White House debacle define his presidency, Zelensky took a bold step. He announced a surprise visit to Beijing to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The move was unprecedented, as China had maintained a careful balancing act in the Ukraine conflict, publicly advocating for peace while subtly aligning with Russia. The announcement sent shockwaves through Washington and Moscow alike. In Washington, political analysts speculated whether Zelensky's outreach to China was a direct message to the U.S., signaling that if American support wavered, Ukraine would look elsewhere. Republican lawmakers blasted the move, with Senator Josh Hawley tweeting, "Zelensky meeting with Xi? Unbelievable. The U.S. has given Ukraine billions, and now they run to Beijing." At the same time, Moscow viewed the development with suspicion. While China and Russia had deepened their partnership, Beijing had never explicitly endorsed the war. If Zelensky could persuade China to play a more active diplomatic role, it might complicate Putin's strategy. During the highly publicized Beijing summit, Zelensky and Xi Jinping discussed Ukraine's security concerns, potential economic aid, and China's role in brokering a ceasefire. In a joint statement, China called for mutual security guarantees and an immediate end to hostilities, though Beijing stopped short of offering military support. The visit, however, had its intended effect. It forced Washington to reevaluate its stance. The Biden administration, which had initially attempted to downplay the Oval Office incident, now found itself facing mounting pressure. Zelensky's outreach to China raised alarms among U.S. policymakers, who feared that Ukraine might pivot toward Beijing if America failed to reaffirm its commitment. Behind closed doors, top advisors urged Trump to repair the diplomatic damage. While Trump remained steadfast in his belief that Zelensky had been too demanding, key officials, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, cautioned that pushing Ukraine away could backfire. During a tense National Security Council meeting, Trump reportedly asked his advisors, "Do we need Ukraine more than they need us?" The room fell silent. Finally, a senior Pentagon official responded, "Mr. President, if we lose Ukraine, we lose our leverage in Europe. And if we lose that, we risk letting Russia and China reshape the global order." Realizing the stakes, Trump decided on a strategic shift. In a carefully orchestrated move, the White House reached out to Ukraine's government through back-channel diplomacy. While no formal apology was issued, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien met with Ukrainian officials in Warsaw to discuss reaffirming strategic commitments. The U.S. quietly approved an additional arms shipment to Ukraine, including advanced missile defense systems. At the same time, diplomatic channels were reopened, with discussions about resuming official bilateral talks. Zelensky, while acknowledging the renewed support, made it clear that Ukraine would not be treated as a secondary ally. In a speech to the Ukrainian parliament, he declared, "We are not beggars. We are a nation that fights for freedom, and we will work with those who truly stand by us." The White House, realizing the PR damage, arranged a second meeting, this time in a more controlled setting. In June 2025, President Zelensky returned to Washington, not as a guest seeking aid, but as a leader demanding respect. The meeting between Trump and Zelensky was far more measured, with both sides emphasizing mutual interests and a renewed understanding. While the scars of the Oval Office confrontation remained, the relationship had been recalibrated. The message was clear. Ukraine was no longer just a dependent ally. It was a sovereign nation demanding its due. As Zelensky boarded his plane back to Kyiv, he knew one thing for certain. The fight for Ukraine's survival extended beyond the battlefield. It was also being fought in the halls of power across the world.